Let me guess, another drug seeker with a convenient chest pain story. Nurse Rosalind Pearce's laugh was sharp and dismissive as she looked Dr. Theodore Langley up and down, taking in his sweat-soaked orange polo shirt and dark blue jeans under the harsh emergency room lighting. The midday sun poured through the hospital's skylights, making his genuine distress clearly visible. But Rosalind saw only her own biased assumptions. "You probably Googled heart attack symptoms on your way here, didn't you?" She made no move to take his vital signs or even acknowledge the medical credentials and insurance information he'd placed on her desk. Instead, she whispered loudly to another nurse, "They get more creative every day with these scams." Dr. Theodore Langley endured her humiliation silently, knowing that this same emergency department would be his responsibility to oversee starting tomorrow. And Nurse Pearce had just provided him with a perfect example of the discriminatory practices he'd been hired to eliminate. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Dr. Theodore Langley had an ordinary start to his morning. He usually runs 3 miles in the morning before the day begins in the streets close to St. Mary's General Hospital. He'll soon be working there as the Chief of Staff, a title he will receive in less than a day. He realized it was going to be their emergency department, where he was going to be on duty for the last day now. But when the stabbing, crushing pain had come over his chest during mile 2, forcing him to stop and gasp for breath against a lamppost, Theodore knew this was not going to be the time for introductions or revelations. Now was the time to be patient, to see how the future staff treated people who came through the door in medical distress. Under the harsh white fluorescent lights of the busy emergency department triage desk, Theodore felt Nurse Rosalind Pearce's sharp scrutiny upon him. The unwanted scrutiny reminded him of a literal light. Her red scrubs seemed to match the venom in her eye as she purposely ignored the insurance card and medical identification he had placed before her. The intense overhead lighting provided no refuge, making the man's heavy breathing and the glistening sweat on his dark skin too obvious for anybody to miss. At least anybody trained to see. "I told the nurse that I had substernal chest pressure radiating to my left arm, with diaphoresis and slight dyspnea," said Theodore, his voice steady despite tightness in his chest. 15 minutes ago, while exercising, the onset was unanticipated. Judging my diagnosis for possible acute coronary syndrome is essential. "Oh my, Amanda. I had no idea you were so lonely," Rosalind said, glancing toward the nurse organizing charts. "Oh, listen to that, Amanda. There is actually a doctor in here," she said, doctor sarcastically. "It's funny how they all become medical experts when they want to inappropriately get high." Theodore took in Amanda's discomfort. The younger nurse must have felt something conflicting, whether to follow her supervisor's actions or to acknowledge the clear evidence of medical distress. The incident struck him profoundly, providing an excellent example of how institutional prejudice operates through both action and inaction. The chest pain intensified, a vice-like pressure that made Theodore's next breath shallow and difficult. He placed his hand over his heart, a gesture so instinctive and genuine that several nearby patients looked up with concern. But Rosalind Pearce saw only what she wanted to see. "Save the performance for someone who's buying tickets," she said, her voice carrying across the waiting area loud enough for other patients and families to hear. "We see this act about 50 times a week. Young guy comes in, claims chest pain, hopes to walk out with some prescription painkillers. The only emergency here is how desperate some people get for drugs." The words hit Theodore like physical blows, each assumption a violation of everything he'd dedicated his career to upholding. In his 15 years of emergency medicine, followed by 5 years in hospital administration, he'd seen discrimination in healthcare settings before. He'd fought it, reported it, implemented training programs to combat it. But experiencing it firsthand feeling the helplessness of being reduced to a stereotype while genuine medical symptoms were dismissed, created a depth of understanding no textbook could provide. "If you could please just check my vital signs," Theodore said, maintaining his composure even as another wave of chest pressure made him grip the edge of the desk. "I understand your concerns, but basic triage protocols require assessment of anyone presenting with cardiac symptoms." Rosalind laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the bright, sterile environment. "Basic triage protocols? Now you're going to tell me how to do my job?" She turned back to Amanda, speaking loudly enough for half the waiting room to hear. "They watch one episode of a medical show and think they can fool us with fancy terminology. What's next? Are you going to diagnose yourself?" Theodore's mind cataloged every violation of medical ethics and patient rights occurring before him. The failure to perform basic triage assessment, the public humiliation of a patient seeking medical care, the dismissal of reported symptoms without examination, the assumption of drug-seeking behavior based solely on appearance and prejudice. As the incoming chief of staff, he would have comprehensive documentation of these failures within hours. But right now, as Theodore the patient, he was powerless against the systematic discrimination playing out in broad daylight. Definitely the emergency room is busy with midday activity with bright fluorescent lighting up the whole area. While other patients waited in discomfort or anxiousness, many of them now looked between Theodore and Nurse Pearce. Their expressions varied from sympathy to uncomfortable recognition at the unfair treatment they were witnessing. The skylights should have filled the place with natural light that throws the ambience entire clear, but it rather showed the injustice less arc back it. Nurse Pearce picked up the insurance card from Theodore like it was dirty. She held it at arm's distance. She announced premium coverage to no one in particular. "May be taken or counterfeit. Amanda, be sure to check this card extra vigilantly. I get the feeling that this guy isn't who he says he is." It would have been funny if it hadn't been such a serious time. The claims Theodore Langley made about his identity weren't quite what Rosalind expected. Within 24 hours, she would find out that the man she was publicly humiliating and denying medical care was in fact her new boss, the physician administrator, who had been brought in to address issues like the one she was currently exhibiting. Theodore experienced another rush of pressure in his chest, one so intense that he shut his eyes momentarily and concentrated on his breathing. When he opened his eyes, he saw many people in the waiting area watching him in concern. An older woman in a blue jacket shook her head at Nurse Pearce's conduct. A middle-aged man, wearing a green shirt and blue jacket, appeared ready to speak. Even some of the other medical staff appeared to be uncomfortable with the triage desk incident. "Look," Theodore said, his professional training helping him remain calm despite the escalating discrimination and his worsening symptoms. "I'm not asking for any medications. I'm asking for basic medical evaluation of cardiac symptoms. An EKG takes 5 minutes and could rule out serious pathology. If my symptoms are not cardiac in nature, I'll accept that determination from a qualified physician after appropriate examination." Rosalind's face flushed with anger at what she perceived as continued challenges to her authority. "Oh, so now you're not just telling me how to do my job, you're telling the doctors how to do theirs too." She slammed Theodore's insurance card down on the desk. "I've been working in emergency medicine for 12 years, and I can spot a drug seeker from across the room. You're not having a heart attack, you're having a craving attack." The words hung in the air like a physical object, a mockery further emphasized by the bright lights that gave no refuge to the shadows. Theodore took it all in. He knew this would inform much of his approach to changing the culture of the hospital. There was a time when one nurse was all it took to unleash an avalanche of animosity on racism. As if to emphasize his dismissal of Rosalind, Theodore's chest pain tightened up again, making him lean forward a bit, taking in a few careful breaths. The motion was slight but obvious to someone with medical training. Those present in the waiting room began to fidget as they realized a man in distress was being denied not just medical care, but humanity too. Theodore straightened before her and looked at her with quiet dignity. In 18 hours, he would walk into this same hospital as chief of staff and put into action the full range of changes such moments now made necessary. But presently, he was just a patient's Theodore, seeing with his own eyes how emergency medical could turn into a lesson in humiliation, simply because of the color of his skin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the harsh lighting fell onto the scene that would soon spark institutional change. Nurse Rosalind Pearce persisted in her condescending treatment, unaware that she was creating the ideal case study for the new chief of staff as an example of everything he was hired to fix. Theodore Langley had lived through it all, taking note of everything for the day when the sun would rise over tomorrow. The fluorescent lights above the emergency department were unforgiving. Dr. Theodore Langley shifted uncomfortably in the plastic waiting room chair. The orange polo shirt was sticking to his back because of sweat. His chest discomfort was worsening, as was the situation in the hospital. The dark blue jeans he wore after morning jogging started getting tight due to breathing being more difficult now. Nurse Rosalind Pearce stood behind the reception desk in red scrubs, raised her voice so everyone in the waiting room could hear. Theodore Langley could hear everything being directed at him, thanks to her positioning. "You know, Amanda," she called to the younger nurse in blue hospital scrubs, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and you develop a sixth sense about these things." Nurse Amanda Reyes appeared uneasy while handling the files of patients. She seemed like someone who was aware of what was occurring around her and was being roped into something that they did not want to be part of. The dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she kept glancing nervously between Nurse Rosalind Pearce and Dr. Theodore Langley. "What do you mean?" Amanda asked quietly, obviously hoping to keep the conversation low-key. But subtlety was not Nurse Rosalind Pearce's intention. She gestured broadly with her clipboard, making sure her movements caught Dr. Theodore Langley's attention. "Oh, you'll learn to spot them a mile away. The frequent flyers, they come in with these elaborate stories about chest pain, back pain, mysterious ailments that somehow always require the good stuff, if you know what I mean." Dr. Theodore Langley pressed his lips together, fighting back both physical discomfort and rising indignation. As someone who had spent years studying the psychology of institutional bias, he recognized the performance for what it was. Yet experiencing it firsthand felt entirely different from reading about it in medical journals. His chest tightened further, whether from his cardiac symptoms or the stress of the situation, he couldn't tell. "They've got all the right words," Nurse Rosalind Pearce continued, her voice growing louder. "They'll throw around medical terminology like they went to school for it. Substernal pressure, radiating pain, dyspnea on exertion. Please, anyone can look that stuff up on the internet these days." The bitter irony wasn't lost on Dr. Theodore Langley. He had used those exact terms because he had indeed gone to school for it. Multiple schools, in fact. His medical degree from Johns Hopkins, his residency at Massachusetts General, his fellowship in emergency medicine at UCLA. The credentials that Nurse Rosalind Pearce dismissed as internet searches represented decades of his life devoted to healing others. An elderly woman sitting across from Dr. Theodore Langley looked up from her magazine, her gray eyebrows furrowed with concern. She wore a blue jacket over a floral dress and kept glancing between him and the nurses with obvious discomfort at what she was witnessing. "Rosalind," Amanda whispered, trying to redirect the conversation. "Maybe we should focus on getting everyone processed." But Nurse Rosalind Pearce was just getting started. She moved closer to Dr. Theodore Langley's section of the waiting area, ostensibly to check on other patients, but clearly maintaining her commentary. "The really clever ones, they research symptoms online. They know exactly what to say to try to get admitted. Chest pain is a classic, because they know we have to take it seriously for liability reasons." Dr. Theodore Langley's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Every word was a violation of basic patient dignity and medical ethics. As the incoming chief of staff, he was getting an education in systemic failures that no boardroom presentation could have provided. He made mental notes about policy changes that would be implemented immediately upon his official start date. His chest pain intensified, a sharp pressure that made him lean forward slightly. The movement caught Nurse Rosalind Pearce's attention, and her eyes lit up with vindictive satisfaction. "Look at the timing," she announced to anyone who could hear. "Just as we are talking about dramatic presentations, our friend over there is displaying symptoms. Isn't it funny how that works?" Various other patients turned their heads, and they were not discreet about their look of disgust. Dr. Theodore Langley felt utter humiliation to be made a spectacle of when he truly suffered. Never did he feel more cognizant of how merely being black made what was a real medical emergency feel very much like a public shaming. "Excuse me?" Dr. Theodore Langley said, an earthquake of panic low and slow in his belly. "I want the attending physician, please. My symptoms are getting worse and I need to be seen immediately," she says. Nurse Rosalind Pearce gave a long sigh and rolled her eyes for effect. "Of course you do. I'm sure it has gotten worse in the last 5 minutes. Dr. Nakamura is handling actual emergencies at this time, genuine patients requiring authentic medical treatment, as opposed to individuals seeking drug prescriptions." "I am not seeking drugs," Dr. Theodore Langley replied firmly, his professional composure holding despite the circumstances. "I am experiencing cardiac symptoms that require medical evaluation. This is a basic patient right." "Patient rights," Nurse Rosalind Pearce mocked, turning back to Amanda with theatrical exasperation. "They always know about patient rights when they're not getting what they want, but they don't seem to understand that emergency departments are for emergencies, not for fishing expeditions." Suddenly, Sophia Nakamura emerged from the automatic doors leading to the treatment areas. The woman has black hair in a bun with dark green scrubs and a white coat. She walked quickly, strongly, and with purpose. It was the determined gait of a woman who was managing many important cases at once. Dr. Langley's spirits were lifted. Certainly, another physician would note the inappropriateness of the situation and provide proper medical assessment. "Sophia," Nurse Rosalind Pearce called out, intercepting the doctor before she could notice Dr. Theodore Langley independently. "Just wanted to update you on the waiting room situation. We've got the usual Monday morning crowd. Nothing urgent out here. A few minor complaints. One possible drug seeker who's getting increasingly agitated." Dr. Sophia Nakamura glanced briefly in Dr. Theodore Langley's direction, but her view was partially blocked by Nurse Rosalind Pearce's positioning. "Okay, thanks, Rosalind. Just keep me posted if anything changes. I've got a stroke alert coming in and a trauma from that construction accident." And just like that, she was gone, disappearing back through the automatic doors without having made any independent assessment of the patients waiting for care. Dr. Theodore Langley watched her white coat vanish and realized how completely Nurse Rosalind Pearce had manipulated the interaction. The attending physician had never even seen him clearly, let alone evaluated his condition. The systemic nature of the discrimination was becoming clear. It wasn't just individual bias, it was institutional failure on multiple levels. Nurse Rosalind Pearce held the power to filter information, to control access, to shape narratives before physicians could make independent judgments. "See?" Nurse Rosalind Pearce said triumphantly, turning back toward Dr. Theodore Langley. "Dr. Nakamura trusts my clinical judgment. I've been screening patients for her for years. She knows I don't waste her time with non-emergencies." Dr. Theodore Langley's chest pain spiked again, accompanied now by a concerning shortness of breath. He leaned forward, pressing his hand against his sternum, trying to manage the discomfort through breathing techniques he had learned during his own medical training. The movement did not go unnoticed. Nurse Rosalind Pearce nudged Amanda and pointed in his direction. "Amanda, watch this." Classic attention-seeking behavior, right on cue when he realizes he's not getting the response he wants. But Amanda's expression had shifted from uncomfortable compliance to genuine concern. "Rosalind, he really doesn't look good. Maybe we should at least get vitals." "That's exactly what they want," Nurse Rosalind Pearce snapped, her voice sharp enough to make Amanda step back. "The minute you start treating their performance as real, you're giving them what they came for. Trust me, I've seen this exact scenario dozens of times." The elderly woman in the blue jacket had put down her magazine entirely now, watching the exchange with obvious distress. She leaned forward as if to speak, but seemed intimidated by Nurse Rosalind Pearce's aggressive demeanor. Dr. Theodore Langley's condition was genuinely deteriorating, and he found himself in an impossible position. Every expression of his authentic medical distress was being weaponized against him as evidence of manipulation. The very symptoms that should have prompted immediate care were instead being used to justify withholding treatment. "I think," Nurse Rosalind Pearce announced loudly, reaching for the phone at her station, "that we might need some additional supervision out here. Sometimes these situations can escalate when people don't get the drugs they're looking for." Dr. Theodore Langley's head snapped up despite his discomfort. "What are you doing?" "Just taking appropriate precautions," she replied with false sweetness, already dialing. "David, it's Rosalind in the ER. Can you come up here when you get a chance? We've got a patient who might become difficult. Just want you nearby in case the situation escalates." The humiliation was complete. Not only was he being denied medical care, he was now being characterized as a potential threat requiring security monitoring. Dr. Theodore Langley had never felt more powerless, despite knowing that tomorrow his nameplate would be mounted on the Chief of Staff's office door. Within minutes, security guard David Okafor appeared, a tall man in a navy blue uniform shirt and dark pants. His presence immediately changed the energy of the waiting room, as other patients began to stare more openly at Dr. Theodore Langley, now clearly marked as someone to be watched. "Everything okay up here?" David asked, positioning himself where he could maintain visual contact with Dr. Theodore Langley while speaking to Nurse Rosalind Pearce. "Just being proactive," she replied with satisfaction. "We've got a patient who's been increasingly agitated about not getting the attention he thinks he deserves. Wanted you nearby in case he becomes a problem." Dr. Theodore Langley looked around the waiting room, seeing his situation through the eyes of the other patients and families present. A black man, now under obvious security surveillance, being publicly characterized as dangerous for seeking medical care. The shame and anger warred with his continuing chest discomfort, creating a perfect storm of physical and emotional distress. Even as he endured this degrading ordeal, he was still taking notes as the administrator. Every policy breach, every patient indignity, and every failure in institutional oversight. The hospital was about to undergo the most extensive reform in its history after Nurse Rosalind Pearce, in an earlier instance, became the whistleblower, ensuring no other patients received the same treatment as what came before. The contrast almost became unbearable. In an attempt to humiliate him, she would ensure her own professional undoing. The fluorescent lights hummed above him as Dr. Theodore Langley shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair. The pain in his chest radiated down his left arm. The bright sunlight from the ER windows and the weather situation frustrated him more than anything else. He tried to be patient and go through the right channels, but Nurse Rosalind Pearce was forcing him to go in a direction he had not wished to take. With a measured breath, Dr. Theodore Langley stood up and walked to the nurse's station. Nurse Rosalind Pearce was seated there. She was aggressively typing on her keyboard. Her red scrubs stood out against the white counter. The blonde hair she wore in a tight ponytail appeared to complement her stiff demeanor. She glared up when she felt his shadow fall across her working space. "Nurse Pearce," said Dr. Theodore Langley. He spoke through the pain in his chest, even as he pulled the covers up. "I'm a doctor, actually. My work experience spans over 15 years in emergency medicine and cardiology. I'm not making up these symptoms. I know precisely what I feel, and I'm telling you I need immediate cardiac evaluation." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Nurse Rosalind Pearce's eyes narrowed with what could only be described as contempt, and she let out a harsh laugh that echoed across the busy emergency department. Several other staff members turned to look, and Dr. Theodore Langley felt the weight of their stares as Nurse Rosalind Pearce prepared to make a spectacle of his revelation. "Oh, so now you're a doctor?" Nurse Rosalind Pearce said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she stood up from her chair, making sure to project her words loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "That's rich. That's absolutely rich. Let me guess. You went to Harvard Medical School too, right? Maybe you're a world-renowned cardiologist who just happens to show up at my emergency room demanding drugs?" Dr. Theodore Langley felt a flash of anger but maintained his composure, recognizing that any emotional response would only fuel her narrative. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I have my medical license in my wallet. I can provide you with my DEA number, my hospital affiliations, references from colleagues. I'm simply asking for basic medical care that any patient with these symptoms should receive." But Nurse Rosalind Pearce was already shaking her head dismissively, her hand held up as if to physically stop his words from reaching her. Anyone can fake credentials these days. Anyone can look up medical terminology online and memorize a few symptoms. "You think this is my first day? You think I haven't seen every con in the book?" She reached across the counter and snatched his insurance card from where he had placed it earlier, holding it up to the light with exaggerated scrutiny. Her performance was clearly intended for the growing audience of patients and staff members who had begun to gather around the nurse's station. Dr. Theodore Langley noticed several families in the waiting area watching the interaction with obvious discomfort, their faces showing confusion and concern at the hostile treatment they were witnessing. "This card looks suspicious to me," Nurse Rosalind Pearce announced loudly, turning the insurance card over in her hands, as if she were examining evidence at a crime scene. "The colors seem off. The printing quality isn't quite right. I've seen plenty of fake insurance cards, and this one has all the hallmarks." Dr. Theodore Langley stared at her in disbelief. His insurance card was completely legitimate, issued by his employer's premium healthcare provider. The accusation was so absurd, so obviously fabricated, that he momentarily struggled to find words. Around them, he could see other patients shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering among themselves about what they were witnessing. "Nurse Pearce, that card is absolutely legitimate. If you call the insurance company, they'll verify my coverage immediately. But right now, I need medical attention. I'm asking for a basic EKG. Given my symptoms, chest pain with radiation down my left arm, shortness of breath, and a family history of cardiac disease, an electrocardiogram is standard protocol. It takes 5 minutes and could potentially save my life." The mention of an EKG seemed to trigger an even stronger reaction from Nurse Rosalind Pearce. She slammed his insurance card down on the counter with enough force to make several other staff members jump. Her face had flushed red with what appeared to be genuine anger, as if his medical knowledge was somehow a personal affront to her authority. "Playing doctor now, are we?" she hissed, her voice taking on a venomous quality that made several nearby patients visibly recoil. "Throwing around medical terminology you probably looked up on WebMD? You think you can waltz in here, fake some chest pain, demand expensive tests, and we'll just roll over and give you whatever drugs you're really after?" Dr. Theodore Langley felt his chest pain intensify. Whether from stress or the underlying cardiac issue, he couldn't be sure. But Nurse Rosalind Pearce's refusal to provide basic medical care was now entering dangerous territory. An EKG was one of the most basic diagnostic tools in emergency medicine, completely non-invasive, and standard protocol for any patient presenting with his symptoms. "I'm not asking for drugs," he said firmly, his patience finally beginning to wear thin. "I'm asking for diagnostic evaluation, an EKG, basic vital signs, maybe a chest X-ray. These are standard procedures for any patient with cardiac symptoms. This isn't about medication at all. But Nurse Rosalind Pearce was already shaking her head emphatically, her hands planted firmly on her hips in a gesture of absolute refusal. We don't waste valuable medical resources on obvious drug seekers who think they can manipulate the system by pretending to be doctors. Do you have any idea how much an EKG costs? How much staff time you're demanding? These resources are for real patients with real emergencies, not for people running scams. The conversation had grown loud enough to attract attention from across the emergency department. Dr. Theodore Langley noticed several medical staff members pausing in their duties to observe the confrontation. Among them, a woman in a white coat with short brown hair and an orange blouse under her blue physician's jacket approached the nurse's station with obvious concern. Dr. Catherine Brennan had been reviewing patient charts when the commotion caught her attention. As a cardiology specialist with over 12 years of experience, she had developed a keen sense for recognizing genuine cardiac distress, and something about the man's demeanor and symptoms struck her as legitimate. His description of his symptoms had been medically accurate, his vital signs appeared concerning even from a distance, and his request for an EKG was entirely appropriate given his presentation. "Excuse me," Dr. Catherine Brennan interjected, stepping closer to the nurse's station. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did this patient request an EKG for chest pain symptoms?" Dr. Theodore Langley felt a surge of hope as he recognized the voice of medical reason entering the conversation. Finally, someone with actual medical training who might evaluate his condition objectively rather than through the lens of prejudice and assumption. "Dr. Brennan," Nurse Rosalind Pearce said, her tone immediately shifting to one of professional deference, though the underlying hostility remained barely concealed. "This individual is attempting to manipulate the system. He's claiming to be a physician himself, demanding expensive tests for what is clearly drug-seeking behavior. I've seen this pattern dozens of times." Dr. Catherine Brennan looked between Nurse Rosalind Pearce and Dr. Theodore Langley, her trained eye taking in his appearance, his obvious discomfort, and the way he was unconsciously favoring his left arm. Everything about his presentation suggested genuine cardiac distress, not the fabricated symptoms of someone seeking drugs. "What specific symptoms are you experiencing?" Dr. Catherine Brennan asked Dr. Theodore Langley directly, her professional demeanor cutting through the charged atmosphere that Nurse Rosalind Pearce had created. "Substernal chest pressure that began about an hour ago during light exercise," Dr. Theodore Langley replied, grateful to finally speak with someone who understood medical terminology. "The pain radiates down my left arm, accompanied by shortness of breath and mild diaphoresis. I have a family history of coronary artery disease, and given my age and risk factors, I believe cardiac evaluation is warranted." Dr. Catherine Brennan nodded, her expression growing more serious with each symptom he described. His medical vocabulary was precise. His description of symptoms was textbook presentation for possible cardiac event, and his request for evaluation was entirely appropriate. She was about to suggest immediate triage when Nurse Rosalind Pearce stepped between them, her body language making it clear that she had no intention of allowing this conversation to continue. "Dr. Brennan, I appreciate your concern, but I've been handling this situation," Nurse Rosalind Pearce said firmly, her voice taking on an edge that suggested challenge to her authority would not be tolerated. "This individual has been coached on medical terminology. Anyone can memorize symptoms from the internet. I've already determined that he doesn't require immediate attention, and I don't want to waste your valuable time on an obvious scam." Dr. Catherine Brennan hesitated, caught between her medical instincts and the complex politics of hospital hierarchy. Nurse Rosalind Pearce was a senior staff member with years of experience, and challenging her assessment publicly could create workplace tensions. Yet everything about the patient's presentation suggested legitimate medical emergency that required immediate evaluation. Perhaps we could just do a quick EKG to rule out any immediate concerns? Dr. Catherine Brennan suggested diplomatically, trying to find a compromise that would ensure patient safety while maintaining professional relationships. But Nurse Rosalind Pearce was already shaking her head dismissively, her jaw set in a line that brooked no argument. "I'm sorry, Dr. Brennan, but I really think you should focus on the patients who actually need your expertise. This situation is under control, and I don't want to set a precedent of rewarding manipulative behavior with expensive tests." Dr. Theodore Langley watched as his potential ally was systematically dismissed, feeling the last vestiges of hope fade as Dr. Catherine Brennan reluctantly stepped back from the conversation. The cardiology specialist cast one more concerned look in his direction before retreating to her other duties, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to create a larger confrontation. As the emergency department returned to its normal rhythm of activity, Dr. Theodore Langley found himself once again alone with Nurse Rosalind Pearce, whose expression of triumph made it clear that she viewed the interaction as a victory. She had successfully defended her territory, maintained her narrative, and dismissed the only medical professional who had shown interest in actually evaluating his condition. The chest pain continued to radiate down his arm as Dr. Theodore Langley returned to his plastic chair, mentally cataloging every violation of medical ethics and patient rights he had witnessed. Tomorrow, when he officially began his role as Chief of Staff, these observations would prove invaluable in understanding the systemic problems that needed immediate attention. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Nurse Rosalind Pearce surveyed the emergency department with the calculating gaze of someone building a case. Her red scrubs rustled as she moved purposefully toward the nurse's station, where Nurse Amanda Reyes sat updating patient charts. Dr. Theodore Langley remained in the hard plastic chair, his orange polo shirt now showing faint perspiration marks despite the air conditioning, his chest pain a steady reminder of why he'd come here in the first place. "Amanda, I need you to keep an eye on our friend over there," Nurse Rosalind Pearce said, her voice carrying just loud enough for Dr. Theodore Langley to hear every word. "I'm getting more suspicious by the minute. His whole story is falling apart under scrutiny." Nurse Amanda Reyes glanced nervously toward Dr. Theodore Langley, then back at her supervisor. The young nurse wore standard blue scrubs and had been working at St. Mary's for only 6 months. She'd learned quickly that disagreeing with Nurse Rosalind Pearce was a career-limiting move. "What do you mean?" Nurse Amanda Reyes asked quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the conversation. "Think about it," Nurse Rosalind Pearce continued, making no effort to lower her voice. "A man shows up claiming to be a doctor, conveniently has chest pain, knows just enough medical terminology to sound convincing, and expects us to rush him through because he name-drops some credentials? Classic drug-seeking behavior with a sophisticated twist." Dr. Theodore Langley closed his eyes briefly, feeling another wave of chest tightness. In his mind, he was already composing the incident report that would document every detail of this encounter. As the incoming Chief of Staff, he'd seen discrimination complaints before, but witnessing it firsthand revealed layers of institutional failure he'd only read about in academic papers. Nurse Rosalind Pearce picked up the phone at the nurse's station, her movements theatrical and deliberate. "I'm calling to verify his insurance information," she announced. "Something about that card didn't look right to me." She dialed a number, tapping her fingers impatiently on the desk while waiting for someone to answer. Dr. Theodore Langley knew his insurance was legitimate, comprehensive coverage through the hospital's own premium plan for senior staff. But he also knew that wasn't the point. This performance was designed to humiliate and isolate him. "Yes, I need to verify coverage for a Theodore Langley," Nurse Rosalind Pearce said into the phone, speaking loudly enough for half the emergency department to hear. "I have concerns about potential fraud. The card looks suspicious, and the patient's behavior has been questionable. Dr. Theodore Langley watched other patients and families in the waiting area begin to stare. An elderly woman in a blue jacket whispered to her adult daughter. Two teenagers looked up from their phones. The atmosphere of normalcy he'd entered with was being systematically destroyed by one person's prejudice. The heavy footsteps of Administrator Samuel Park echoed across the polished floor as he approached the nurse's station. A middle-aged man in a green dress shirt and blue blazer. He carried himself with the bureaucratic authority of someone who'd mastered hospital politics without necessarily understanding patient care. His arrival sent a ripple of attention through the nearby staff. "Rosalind, what's the situation here?" Administrator Samuel Park asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone already predisposed to support his employee's judgment. "We have a potential problem patient," Nurse Rosalind Pearce replied, hanging up the phone with a satisfied expression. "Claims to be a doctor, insists he needs immediate cardiac evaluation, but his story has more holes than Swiss cheese. I'm currently verifying his insurance because something doesn't add up." Administrator Samuel Park glanced toward Dr. Theodore Langley with the dismissive assessment of someone who'd already reached a conclusion. "Has he been disruptive?" "Not overtly," Nurse Rosalind Pearce admitted, "but he's persistent in ways that concern me. Keeps pushing for tests and treatments, using medical terminology like he's trying to convince us he belongs here. Classic manipulation tactics." Dr. Theodore Langley felt his chest pain intensify as he listened to his character being systematically assassinated. Every word was being twisted, every attempt to communicate his legitimate medical concerns reframed as manipulation or fraud. The institutional machinery was aligning against him with frightening efficiency. "I'll make a note in our system," Administrator Samuel Park said. "If he becomes problematic, we can have security remove him. We can't have people thinking they can come in here and demand services based on false pretenses." The conspiracy was widening exactly as Dr. Theodore Langley had seen in discrimination cases during his previous administrative roles. One person's bias became institutional policy through a series of small accommodations and assumptions. No one was asking the right questions. No one was conducting an independent assessment. The system was protecting itself by excluding him. Security guard David Okafor approached the group, his uniform crisp and his expression neutral but alert. As a black man himself, his presence created a complex dynamic that Dr. Theodore Langley noted with professional interest even through his personal distress. "You called about monitoring a patient?" Security guard David Okafor asked, his eyes briefly meeting Dr. Theodore Langley's across the room. "The gentleman in the orange shirt," Nurse Rosalind Pearce explained. "Potential fraud situation. Claims to be a doctor, but something's off about his whole presentation. Just keep an eye on him in case he escalates when we don't give him what he wants." Security guard David Okafor nodded professionally, but Dr. Theodore Langley caught something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps discomfort with the situation. Still, the security guard took a position where he could observe Dr. Theodore Langley while maintaining his professional duties. Dr. Sophia Nakamura hurried past the group, her white coat indicating her status as an attending physician. Nurse Rosalind Pearce quickly intercepted her. "Dr. Nakamura, just so you're aware, we have a situation with the patient in orange. Potential drug seeker with a sophisticated approach. Claims cardiac symptoms but won't accept that he needs to wait his turn like everyone else." Dr. Sophia Nakamura glanced toward Dr. Theodore Langley, her expression showing the rushed judgment of someone managing multiple priorities. "You've assessed him thoroughly." Nurse Rosalind Pearce lied smoothly. Classic presentation of someone who's researched symptoms online. Very insistent about getting specific tests and medications. "Thanks for the heads up," Dr. Sophia Nakamura replied, already moving toward her next case. The institutional hierarchy had just claimed another participant in the growing exclusion of Dr. Theodore Langley from basic medical care. From his chair, Dr. Theodore Langley observed the careful choreography of discrimination. Each person was making reasonable individual decisions based on information provided by others, but no one was taking responsibility for independent verification. The system was designed to protect itself through shared assumptions and mutual validation. His chest pain was becoming more concerning, the tightness spreading to his left arm in a way that his medical training told him required immediate attention. But he also understood that revealing his desperation would only be interpreted as evidence supporting Nurse Rosalind Pearce's narrative. The insurance verification came back clean. Nurse Rosalind Pearce admitted reluctantly to Administrator Samuel Park. But that doesn't mean much. Fraudsters are getting more sophisticated. They probably have legitimate coverage but are abusing it. The goalpost had moved again. Evidence that contradicted her assumptions was being reinterpreted to support them. Dr. Theodore Langley recognized this pattern from workplace discrimination cases he'd studied, the way bias creates its own logic that becomes immune to contradictory facts. Nurse Amanda Reyes approached Dr. Theodore Langley's chair, her expression conflicted. "Sir, I need to take your blood pressure," she said quietly, glancing back toward Nurse Rosalind Pearce. Finally, Dr. Theodore Langley thought, but his relief was premature. "Just routine monitoring," Nurse Amanda Reyes explained apologetically. "Not for cardiac evaluation. We're still waiting for the attending physician to determine if that's necessary." The blood pressure cuff inflated around his arm, and Dr. Theodore Langley knew the reading would be elevated from both his medical condition and the stress of the discrimination he was experiencing. Sure enough, Nurse Amanda Reyes frowned at the numbers. 160/90. She called back to Nurse Rosalind Pearce. "Probably anxiety from being caught in his lies." Nurse Rosalind Pearce responded dismissively. "Classic stress response when their scheme isn't working." Dr. Theodore Langley closed his eyes and focused on maintaining his composure. In a few hours, he would officially become the chief of staff of this hospital. Every person currently participating in or enabling his mistreatment would answer for their actions. But first, he had to survive this experience, both medically and psychologically. The conspiracy was complete now. From nursing staff to administration to security, a web of assumptions and enabling behavior had created a barrier between him and basic medical care. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the original prejudice, but how quickly and efficiently the institution had organized itself to support and validate that prejudice. His chest pain intensified, and Dr. Theodore Langley realized he was approaching a decision point. He could continue to endure this treatment and hope his medical condition didn't deteriorate further, or he could reveal his identity and position. But revealing himself would end his ability to observe and document the full extent of the institutional failures he was witnessing. As the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the conspiracy of discrimination solidified around him, Dr. Theodore Langley made mental notes that would soon transform into the most comprehensive reform initiative St. Mary's General Hospital had ever experienced. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital emergency room cast their relentless glare over what was rapidly becoming a medical crisis. Dr. Theodore Langley gripped the edge of his plastic chair as another wave of chest pain crashed through him, this one more intense than anything he had experienced during his morning jog. The orange polo shirt he wore was now damp with perspiration, and his breathing had become shallow and labored. Under the bright overhead lighting, his distress was unmistakably visible to anyone with even basic medical training. Yet Nurse Rosalind Pearce, her red scrubs almost seeming to glow under the harsh lights, continued her performance of willful ignorance. She stood at the nurse's station, deliberately loud enough for the entire waiting area to hear, as she spoke to another staff member about patients who waste hospital resources with their elaborate acting. "Some people really think they missed their calling for Hollywood," she declared, shooting a pointed glance in Dr. Theodore Langley's direction. The dramatic breathing, the sweating on cue, the clutching of the chest. It's almost impressive how committed they are to the performance. Dr. Theodore Langley felt his left arm begin to tingle, a sensation that sent alarm bells ringing through his medically trained mind. He had spent years diagnosing and treating cardiac events, and every instinct screamed that his body was sending genuine distress signals. The irony was not lost on him that his extensive medical knowledge might prove worthless if he could not access the very system he would soon be leading. An elderly woman, sitting nearby with her adult daughter, had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. Her blue jacket was pristine, suggesting she took care with her appearance despite being in the emergency room. She leaned toward her daughter and whispered something, but her voice carried further than intended. "That nurse is being awful to that poor man," she said. Her eyes filled with concern as she looked at Dr. Theodore Langley's obvious distress. "Anyone can see he's really suffering." Her daughter, wearing a green blouse and dark jeans, nodded in agreement. "Mom, maybe we should say something. This doesn't seem right." Their conversation seemed to embolden others in the waiting area who had been witnessing the prolonged discrimination. A middle-aged man in an orange shirt and blue jacket, waiting with what appeared to be his teenage son, cleared his throat and addressed Nurse Rosalind Pearce directly. "Excuse me, nurse," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I've been sitting here for 30 minutes, and I can see that gentleman is in real distress. Shouldn't someone at least check his vital signs?" Nurse Rosalind Pearce whirled around, her face flushing with anger at being questioned by patients and families. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but medical professionals are trained to distinguish between genuine emergencies and individuals seeking inappropriate medications. I assure you that we have the situation well in hand." The man's son, a teenager who had been quietly observing, looked incredulous. "But look at him," the young man said, pointing toward Dr. Theodore Langley. "He's sweating and can barely breathe. How is that fake?" Dr. Theodore Langley felt a surge of gratitude toward these strangers who were willing to advocate for him when the medical staff would not. Their willingness to speak up in the face of institutional authority reminded him why patient advocacy programs were so desperately needed in healthcare settings. Nurse Amanda Reyes, who had been quietly processing paperwork nearby, finally looked up and really observed Dr. Theodore Langley's condition. Her hesitation and discomfort with the situation had been growing throughout the morning, and seeing his obvious distress made her question everything she thought she knew about her supervisor's judgment. "Rosalind," she said quietly, approaching the senior nurse with caution, "maybe we should at least get his blood pressure and heart rate. Standard protocol would be to do baseline vitals on any patient presenting with chest pain, regardless of our initial assessment." Nurse Rosalind Pearce's eyes flashed with fury at being questioned by a subordinate in front of patients and families. "Amanda, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I can recognize drug-seeking behavior when I see it, and I don't need junior staff members telling me how to do my job." The public dressing down of Nurse Amanda Reyes seemed to shock even some of the other staff members who had been observing from a distance. Dr. Theodore Langley watched as the young nurse's face reddened with embarrassment and hurt, and he made another mental note about the toxic workplace culture that allowed senior staff to humiliate their colleagues publicly. At that moment, Dr. Sophia Nakamura emerged from one of the treatment rooms, having just finished with another patient. The commotion in the waiting area and the obvious distress of multiple people finally forced her to directly confront the situation she had been avoiding all morning. Her white coat was pristine under the fluorescent lighting as she approached the nurse's station. "What's going on out here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be complicated. Nurse Rosalind Pearce immediately launched into her now familiar narrative. "Doctor, we have a patient who's been here claiming chest pain, but all the signs point to drug-seeking behavior. He's been increasingly dramatic as the morning has progressed, and now he's got other patients stirred up and concerned. Dr. Sophia Nakamura looked at Dr. Theodore Langley, and for the first time all morning, a medical professional actually observed his condition with clinical eyes. What she saw clearly troubled her. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Perspiration beaded his forehead despite the comfortable temperature, and his breathing was visibly labored. "Has anyone taken his vital signs?" she asked, already knowing the answer from Nurse Rosalind Pearce's defensive posture. "Doctor, I've been trying to explain that medical resources shouldn't be wasted on obvious drug seekers," Nurse Rosalind Pearce replied, her voice rising slightly. "This patient has been trying to manipulate staff all morning, claiming medical expertise, and becoming increasingly demanding when we don't immediately provide narcotics." Dr. Sophia Nakamura frowned, her medical training warring with her long-standing trust in Nurse Rosalind Pearce's experience and judgment. She approached Dr. Theodore Langley directly, speaking to him for the first time since their brief interaction earlier in the morning. "Sir, can you describe your current symptoms?" she asked, her clinical demeanor professional but guarded. Dr. Theodore Langley looked up at her, and she could see genuine pain and exhaustion in his eyes. "Doctor, the chest pain has intensified significantly over the past hour. It's now radiating down my left arm, and I'm experiencing shortness of breath that's getting progressively worse. I have a strong family history of cardiac disease, and these symptoms are consistent with a cardiac event requiring immediate evaluation." His articulate description of symptoms and appropriate medical terminology should have immediately prompted action, but Nurse Rosalind Pearce interrupted before Dr. Sophia Nakamura could respond. "You see how he does that?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's obviously looked up cardiac symptoms online and is trying to sound medical to manipulate us into giving him what he wants." Dr. Sophia Nakamura hesitated, caught between her clinical observation of a patient in obvious distress and her reliance on nursing staff assessment. The moment of hesitation was exactly what Nurse Rosalind Pearce needed to reassert control of the situation. "Doctor, you're needed in room 4 for the patient with the actual emergency," she said firmly. "I can handle this situation." The elderly woman in the blue jacket stood up from her chair, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had witnessed enough injustice. "This is disgraceful," she announced to the waiting room at large. "I've never seen a patient treated this way in my 75 years. Someone needs to call the hospital administration." Her declaration seemed to galvanize other patients and families who had been watching the situation unfold. The middle-aged man in the orange shirt nodded in agreement and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the patient advocacy line right now," he announced. "This treatment is completely unacceptable." Nurse Rosalind Pearce realized that the situation was spiraling beyond her control, but rather than reassessing her approach, she doubled down on her position. Her face flushed with anger as she addressed the waiting room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns, but medical professionals are trained to make these determinations. This individual has been disruptive and manipulative all morning, and I will not allow him to continue disturbing other patients who are here for legitimate medical care." The teenager who had spoken earlier looked at her with disbelief. "Disruptive? He's been sitting quietly in pain while you've been loudly talking about him like he's not even here." Dr. Theodore Langley felt another intense wave of chest pain, this one accompanied by nausea and dizziness that forced him to grip his chair to avoid falling. The physical distress was becoming impossible to ignore, but more concerning was his growing realization that his condition might require immediate intervention, that he was being systematically denied. Nurse Amanda Reyes watched his obvious deterioration with growing alarm. Despite her earlier humiliation, she approached Nurse Rosalind Pearce again, her voice urgent with concern. "Rosalind, look at him. Really look at him. His color is terrible, and he's obviously in significant distress. Even if there was some doubt before, We can't ignore this level of symptom presentation." Nurse Rosalind Pearce turned on her subordinate with fury. "Amanda, I have had enough of your questioning my professional judgment. Either trust that I know how to do my job, or perhaps you should consider whether emergency nursing is the right fit for your skill set." The threat was unmistakable, and Nurse Amanda Reyes stepped back as if she had been physically slapped. But something in her expression suggested that the intimidation had backfired, that instead of silencing her concerns, it had clarified exactly what kind of supervisor and colleague she was dealing with. Dr. Theodore Langley watched this exchange through a haze of increasing pain and a growing sense of unreality. The situation had become so absurd, so divorced from any reasonable standard of medical care or human decency, that he found himself considering options he had hoped to avoid. As the new chief of staff, he had wanted to observe the hospital's operations anonymously, to understand the real culture and challenges before implementing changes. The experience had been more revealing than he could have imagined, but it had also put him in genuine medical jeopardy. Security guard David Okafor approached the area, having been summoned by the increasing commotion. His presence seemed to embolden Nurse Rosalind Pearce, who saw an opportunity to assert her authority definitively. "David, I need this individual removed from the premises," she announced loudly. "He's been disruptive all morning. He's clearly not having a medical emergency, and now he's stirring up other patients with his performance. He's interfering with hospital operations." The security guard looked uncertain as he observed Dr. Theodore Langley's condition. "Ma'am, he looks pretty sick to me. Are you sure about this?" "I am absolutely certain," Nurse Rosalind Pearce replied with conviction. "This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior we're trained to recognize. He's hoping that if he escalates his act, we'll give in and provide inappropriate medications." Dr. Theodore Langley realized he was facing an impossible choice. He could continue to maintain his anonymity and risk serious harm to his health, or he could reveal his identity and compromise the evaluation process that was providing such crucial insights into the hospital's problems. The chest pain intensified again, and this time it was accompanied by a sensation he recognized as genuinely dangerous. His medical knowledge told him that he was potentially experiencing a cardiac event that required immediate intervention. The irony that his expertise might be rendered useless by the very system he was meant to lead was not lost on him. As security guard David Okafor stepped closer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but prepared to follow the nurse's directive, Dr. Theodore Langley made his decision. The systematic discrimination, the willful blindness to obvious medical distress, and the institutional complicity he had witnessed were exactly the problems he had been hired to address. But first, he had to survive to do the job. The waiting room fell silent as Dr. Theodore Langley slowly stood from his chair, his breathing labored, but his posture gathering the dignity and authority that Nurse Rosalind Pearce had been trying to strip from him all morning. The fluorescent lights seemed to spotlight the moment as he prepared to reveal the truth that would change everything for everyone present. The anticipation in the room was palpable as patients, families, and staff members sensed that something significant was about to happen. Nurse Rosalind Pearce stood with her arms crossed, confident in her authority and certain of her righteous position, completely unaware that she was about to face the consequences of every discriminatory action she had taken throughout the morning. Dr. Theodore Langley pressed his hand against his chest as another wave of pain coursed through him. The bright fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Emergency Department cast harsh shadows across his strained face, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool morning air filtering through the skylights above. His orange polo shirt clung to his skin, damp from perspiration, while his dark blue jeans felt constricting as he struggled to find a comfortable position in the plastic waiting room chair. Nurse Rosalind Pearce stood behind the reception desk, her red scrubs a stark contrast against the white walls. Still maintaining her dismissive posture, she whispered something to Nurse Amanda Reyes, who shifted uncomfortably and glanced toward Dr. Langley with growing concern. The younger nurse's hesitation was becoming more apparent with each passing minute, but Nurse Pearce's authoritative presence kept her silent. "Ma'am," Dr. Langley called out, his voice strained but still maintaining its professional composure. "I really need medical attention. My symptoms are worsening, and I believe I may be experiencing a cardiac event." Nurse Pearce rolled her eyes dramatically and turned to face him fully, her arms crossed over her chest. "Sir, we've been through this. Your little performance isn't fooling anyone here. We see this act every single day." Dr. Langley felt his heart racing, not just from his medical condition, but from the impossible situation he found himself in. He had conducted anonymous evaluations at other hospitals before, but never had he encountered such blatant discrimination that threatened his own life. The irony wasn't lost on him that tomorrow he was scheduled to officially begin his role as chief of staff at this very institution, yet today he couldn't even receive basic medical care. Security guard David Okafor, a tall man in his green security uniform and blue jacket, maintained his position near Dr. Langley's chair, his muscular frame casting a shadow over the seated doctor. His presence was meant to be intimidating, but David's expression showed growing uncertainty about the situation he'd been asked to monitor. Administrator Samuel Park, wearing his standard blue jacket over an orange dress shirt and dark slacks, approached the reception area with papers in hand. His middle-aged face carried the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but he hadn't bothered to personally assess the situation beyond Nurse Pearce's initial report. "How much longer is this going to continue?" Park asked Nurse Pearce, gesturing toward Dr. Langley. "Other patients are starting to complain about the disruption." Dr. Langley's chest pain intensified, and he gripped the armrest of his chair. The medical professional in him recognized the dangerous progression of his symptoms, while the future administrator noted every violation of patient care protocols happening around him. The situation had reached a critical juncture where his health was genuinely at risk. "I need immediate medical attention," Dr. Langley said, his voice growing more urgent. "I'm experiencing severe chest pain, shortness of breath, and diaphoresis. These are classic symptoms of acute coronary syndrome." Nurse Pearce laughed derisively. "Oh, now you're diagnosing yourself? How convenient that you know all the right medical terms." Dr. Sophia Nakamura, the emergency department attending physician, finally emerged from behind the treatment area doors. Her short-sleeved red medical coat identified her position, and her expression showed the exhaustion of a busy morning shift. She approached the group with apparent reluctance, having avoided direct involvement up to this point. "What's the situation here?" Dr. Nakamura asked, though her tone suggested she was already predisposed to trust her nursing staff's assessment. "Same story as before, doctor," Nurse Pearce replied quickly. "Claims to be having chest pain. Keeps insisting he needs immediate care, but all the signs point to drug-seeking behavior." Dr. Nakamura glanced briefly at Dr. Langley, who was now visibly struggling with his breathing. For a moment, her medical training seemed to override the prejudicial narrative she'd been fed. But Nurse Pearce's confident dismissal held sway. Dr. Langley realized he had reached an impossible crossroads. His condition was deteriorating to the point where delay could be life-threatening, yet revealing his identity would compromise the evaluation process that was meant to assess exactly this type of situation. The choice between his methodology and his life became crystal clear. "I need to tell you something," Dr. Langley said, slowly rising from his chair despite the chest pain. His voice carried a new authority that cut through the ambient noise of the emergency department. "I am Dr. Theodore Langley, and I am the incoming chief of staff of this hospital." The effect was immediate and electric. Nurse Pearce's confident smirk faltered, Administrator Park's papers slipped from his hands, and security guard Okafor took a step backward. Dr. Nakamura's eyes widened, as the implications of what she just heard began to register. "That's ridiculous," Nurse Pearce sputtered, though her voice lacked its previous conviction. "You're lying. You think making up some story is going to get you drugs?" Dr. Langley reached into his wallet with steady hands, despite his medical distress, and produced his hospital identification badge and medical license. Under the bright overhead lighting, the official documents were clearly visible to everyone present. "My employee ID number is 2847, Dr. Langley said clearly. "I was scheduled to begin my official duties tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I came in today to conduct anonymous evaluations of staff behavior and patient care protocols." Administrator Park's face went pale as he recognized the ID number from the personnel files he'd processed just last week. The orange shirt that had seemed so casual now appeared different in context, as did Dr. Langley's calm professional demeanor throughout the entire ordeal. "This can't be happening," Nurse Pearce whispered, but her denial was crumbling as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Dr. Nakamura stepped forward, her medical training finally overriding all other considerations. "Dr. Langley, we need to get you immediate cardiac evaluation. Let's get you into treatment room 1 right now." "No, no, no," Nurse Pearce interjected frantically. "He's lying. Anyone can fake documents." As if summoned by the chaos, Dr. Jonathan Ellis pushed through the emergency department doors. The tall physician, wearing his long-sleeved medical coat over a green shirt and dark trousers, had his muscular frame and authoritative presence immediately command attention. His timing couldn't have been more perfect or devastating for Nurse Pearce's rapidly crumbling position. "Theodore," Dr. Ellis called out, his face showing immediate concern as he took in his colleague's obvious distress. "I got your message about evaluating St. Mary's today. You look terrible. What's wrong?" The confirmation from Dr. Ellis hit the emergency department like a seismic shock. There was no longer any possibility of denial or rationalization. Dr. Theodore Langley was exactly who he claimed to be, and everyone present had just witnessed or participated in the systematic discrimination of their new chief of staff. Administrator Park began hyperventilating as the legal and professional implications crashed down on him. His career flashed before his eyes as he realized he'd enabled discrimination against the very person hired to reform the hospital's practices. Security guard Okafor immediately stepped away from his intimidating position, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of non-aggression. His security training hadn't prepared him for the moment when the person he'd been asked to monitor turned out to be his ultimate supervisor. Nurse Amanda Reyes covered her mouth in horror, finally understanding why she'd felt so uncomfortable throughout the entire interaction. Her junior status had made her reluctant to challenge Nurse Pearce's authority, but now she realized she'd witnessed something that would haunt her career. "Get him on a monitor immediately," Dr. Ellis commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "How long has he been experiencing symptoms?" Dr. Nakamura finally sprang into full action, calling for a wheelchair and cardiac monitoring equipment. The professional machinery of emergency medicine finally activated, but the damage to reputations and careers had already been irreversibly set in motion. Nurse Pearce stood frozen behind her desk, her red scrubs now seeming to symbolize the warning signs everyone had ignored. Her confident discrimination had transformed into career-ending misconduct in a matter of minutes, and the weight of her actions was beginning to settle on her shoulders. I didn't know," she stammered weakly, but the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. Dr. Langley, even in his medical distress, looked directly at each person who had participated in his mistreatment. His evaluation was complete, and the results were more damning than he could have anticipated. The systematic nature of the discrimination, the institutional enablement, and the complete failure of basic patient care protocols had all been documented through his personal experience. As medical staff finally surrounded him with the care he should have received hours earlier, Dr. Langley reflected on the cruel irony that his life-threatening medical emergency had provided the most comprehensive evaluation of hospital practices he'd ever conducted. The cost had been enormous, but the insights gained would drive the systematic reforms he'd been hired to implement. The emergency department continued to buzz with frantic activity as word of the situation began to spread. Phone calls were being made to hospital administration, witness statements were being mentally prepared, and careers were being reconsidered. The revelation had changed everything in an instant, and there would be no going back to the way things were just minutes before. Dr. Theodore Langley finally closed his eyes as proper medical care began, knowing that justice was finally beginning to unfold. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital Emergency Department seemed brighter now, casting harsh shadows across faces that had suddenly turned pale with realization. Dr. Theodore Langley sat on the examination bed, finally receiving the medical attention he had desperately needed for hours, while the chaos of his revelation continued to ripple through the department like aftershocks from an earthquake. Dr. Catherine Brennan worked efficiently, attaching EKG leads to Dr. Theodore Langley's chest, while her hands trembled slightly with a mixture of professional concern and personal horror at what she had witnessed. The orange polo shirt he had worn during his morning jog was now draped over a nearby chair, replaced by a hospital gown that finally afforded him the dignity of proper patient care. Blood pressure is elevated. But that's expected given the circumstances, Dr. Catherine Brennan murmured, her voice carrying a weight of unspoken apology. Dr. Langley, I am so deeply sorry for what you experienced here today. This is not who we are supposed to be. Across the room, Nurse Rosalind Pearce stood frozen in her red scrubs, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, panic, and desperate calculation. The confident authority she had wielded just minutes earlier had evaporated completely, leaving behind a woman who suddenly understood the magnitude of her actions. Dr. Langley, please. Nurse Rosalind Pearce began, her voice cracking as she took a tentative step forward. I had no idea who you were. If I had known, I never would have treated you that way. You have to understand, we see so many people trying to get drugs, and I was just trying to protect the hospital's resources. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Dr. Theodore Langley looked up from the EKG machine, his dark eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity that made her flinch. Nurse Pearce, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of his position for the first time that day. Are you telling me that the color of my skin made you assume I was seeking drugs? That my medical knowledge, my insurance, my clear articulation of symptoms meant nothing because of how I looked? Nurse Rosalind Pearce's mouth opened and closed without sound, the reality of her prejudice laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light. Around them, other staff members who had gathered to witness the aftermath began to shift uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their own actions were under scrutiny. Administrator Samuel Park appeared at the doorway, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. His blue jacket was wrinkled, sweat visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Behind him, security guard David Okafor lingered uncertainly, the same man who had been called to monitor Dr. Theodore Langley as a potential threat, now unsure of his role in the unfolding crisis. Dr. Langley, Samuel Park said, his voice carefully modulated. I've contacted Board Chairman Sullivan. She's on her way. I want you to know that we take this situation extremely seriously and we're prepared to conduct a full investigation into what happened here today. Dr. Sophia Nakamura, who had been conspicuously absent during much of Dr. Theodore Langley's ordeal, now stood at the edge of the group, her green scrub top a stark contrast to her ashen face. The emergency department attending physician who had trusted Nurse Rosalind Pearce's assessment without conducting her own examination now realized the professional implications of her negligence. I should have examined you myself, Dr. Sophia Nakamura admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I violated basic medical protocols by delegating patient assessment entirely to nursing staff. There's no excuse for that level of negligence. Nurse Amanda Reyes, the junior nurse who had been reluctantly drawn into Nurse Rosalind Pearce's discriminatory behavior, stood near the nursing station with tears streaming down her face. Her orange scrub top seemed to glow under the overhead lights as she struggled with the weight of her complicity. "I knew it was wrong," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. When Nurse Rosalind Pearce was making those comments, when she refused to take his vital signs, I knew it was wrong. But I was afraid to speak up. I was afraid of challenging a senior nurse, afraid of making waves. But that man could have died because of our prejudice. The honesty of her confession seemed to unlock something in the room. Other staff members, who had witnessed various parts of Dr. Theodore Langley's mistreatment, began to speak up, their voices creating a chorus of belated recognition and regret. "I saw her examining his insurance card like it was fake," said one of the registration clerks. "She made such a show of it, talking loud enough for everyone to hear about suspicious documents. She called security on him for no reason," added another voice. "He was sitting quietly, clearly in pain, and she acted like he was dangerous." Dr. Theodore Langley listened to these admissions while Dr. Catherine Brennan continued her examination, each revelation confirming what he had observed during his hours of discriminatory treatment. The EKG results showed signs of stress-induced cardiac irregularities, legitimate medical findings that should have prompted immediate attention hours earlier. Nurse Rosalind Pearce watched her colleagues' statements with growing desperation. Her attempts to maintain her position crumbled as witness after witness described her behavior in increasingly damning detail. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "We have quotas. We have administrators breathing down our necks about drug seekers and frequent flyers. I was doing my job, protecting hospital resources. How was I supposed to know he was really a doctor? By treating every patient with dignity and conducting proper assessments regardless of their race," Dr. Theodore Langley replied calmly. "By following basic medical protocols instead of making assumptions based on skin color. By remembering that your job is to provide care, not to act as judge and jury." The arrival of Board Chairman Margaret Sullivan brought a new level of gravity to the situation. She entered the emergency department wearing a navy blue business suit, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her expression. Margaret Sullivan had built her reputation on maintaining the hospital's sterling reputation, and the implications of this incident were immediately clear to her experienced eye. "Dr. Langley," she said, approaching his bedside with the measured steps of someone accustomed to crisis management, "I cannot begin to express how appalled I am by what has transpired here today. This institution prides itself on excellence and equality in healthcare, and what you experienced represents a complete failure of our most basic values." Margaret Sullivan's gaze swept across the assembled staff, her sharp eyes cataloging each person's level of involvement in the incident. When her attention fixed on Nurse Rosalind Pearce, the nurse visibly wilted under the scrutiny. "Nurse Pearce," Margaret Sullivan continued, her voice carrying decades of administrative authority, "your conduct today has not only endangered a patient's life, but has exposed this institution to significant legal and reputational liability. Your nursing license may be in jeopardy, and your employment here is terminated effective immediately." The finality of those words hit Nurse Rosalind Pearce like a physical blow. Her career in healthcare, built over 2 decades, crumbled in an instant. The red scrubs that had represented her authority now seemed like a scarlet letter marking her downfall. "You can't do this," she protested, her voice breaking. "I have seniority. I have rights. One mistake shouldn't end my entire career." "This wasn't one mistake," Dr. Theodore Langley said quietly. "This was a pattern of discriminatory behavior that could have cost me my life. You denied basic medical care based on racial prejudice, recruited other staff to support your bias, and created a hostile environment that violated every principle of medical ethics. Margaret Sullivan nodded grimly. Security footage from the emergency department will be reviewed, and witness statements will be documented. Dr. Langley, you have my assurance that this incident will be investigated thoroughly and that appropriate action will be taken against all parties who participated in or enabled this discrimination. Administrator Samuel Park shifted nervously, suddenly aware that his own quick support of Nurse Rosalind Pearce's assessment without independent verification had marked him as another potential target for disciplinary action. The blue jacket he wore seemed to grow heavier as he realized his own career might be in jeopardy. Dr. Sophia Nakamura stepped forward, her professional integrity compelling her to accept responsibility. Chairman Sullivan, I must acknowledge my own failures in this incident. I allowed nursing staff to make patient assessment decisions that should have required physician oversight. My negligence contributed to Dr. Langley's mistreatment. The emergency department had become an impromptu tribunal, with each participant in the day's events facing the consequences of their actions or inactions. Some, like Dr. Catherine Brennan, had tried to intervene and were now working to provide the care Dr. Theodore Langley should have received immediately. Others, like Nurse Amanda Reyes, had been complicit but showed genuine remorse and recognition of their failures. But Nurse Rosalind Pearce remained defiant even in defeat, unable to fully acknowledge the racist assumptions that had driven her behavior. This is reverse discrimination, she declared desperately. I'm being punished more harshly because he's black. If he had been white, this would be handled quietly. The audacity of her statement stunned everyone present. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her prejudice, she continued to demonstrate the very bias that had created the crisis. Dr. Theodore Langley looked at her with something approaching pity. Nurse Pearce, your inability to recognize your own prejudice even now confirms that terminating your employment is the correct decision. Healthcare requires professionals who can see past their biases to provide equal care to all patients. As security escorted Nurse Rosalind Pearce from the emergency department, her red scrubs a final flash of color before she disappeared through the doors, the atmosphere began to shift toward resolution and reform. The immediate crisis of Dr. Theodore Langley's medical condition was being addressed, but the larger implications of the incident were just beginning to unfold. Margaret Sullivan remained at his bedside, her expression thoughtful as she considered the systemic changes that would be necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Langley, when you officially begin your role as Chief of Staff tomorrow, you'll have our full support in implementing whatever reforms you deem necessary to address the issues that surfaced today. Dr. Theodore Langley nodded slowly, his mind already working on the comprehensive changes that would be required. The painful experience of discrimination had provided him with invaluable insights into the hospital's culture and the urgent need for reform. The fluorescent lights continued to shine down on the emergency department, but the harsh illumination now revealed a transformed environment where the consequences of prejudice had been exposed and justice was finally beginning to take hold. 3 weeks later, the fluorescent lights in Dr. Theodore Langley's new office cast a bright glow over the mahogany desk where termination letters awaited his signature. Outside his window, natural daylight streamed through the glass, illuminating the hospital grounds where he'd walked as a patient just weeks before. Now, wearing a crisp green button-down shirt and navy slacks, he sat in the leather chair of the Chief of Staff, ready to deliver justice that had been 21 days in the making. The first envelope contained Nurse Rosalind Pearce's termination letter. Her career at St. Mary's General Hospital had ended the morning after his revelation, but the formal documentation required careful legal review. The letter detailed every violation of patient rights, medical ethics, and hospital policy she had committed during those terrible hours in the emergency department. Her nursing license was under review by the state board, and 3 other hospitals had already been contacted about her conduct. The discrimination that had seemed so powerful in that moment now appeared as nothing more than career suicide committed in broad daylight. Dr. Theodore Langley's chest had healed, but the memory of gasping for breath while being denied basic medical care remained vivid. The cardiac episode had been stress-induced, exacerbated by the very treatment he'd received from the staff sworn to help him. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman who'd nearly killed him with negligence had been undone by her own prejudice. Administrator Samuel Park's disciplinary letter lay beneath Nurse Rosalind Pearce's termination. His failure to conduct independent assessment and his immediate support of discriminatory treatment had earned him a formal reprimand and mandatory sensitivity training. The man who'd stood in that emergency room dismissing a patient's legitimate medical crisis now faced monthly reviews and probationary status. His administrative authority had been significantly reduced, and his next mistake would be his last. Security guard David Okafor's file showed a different outcome. The guard had questioned Dr. Theodore Langley's presence, but hadn't participated in the active discrimination. His disciplinary action was lighter, but still significant enough to send a clear message throughout the hospital security department. Every guard now understood that patient harassment would result in immediate termination, regardless of who initiated the request. The consequences extended beyond individual punishments. Dr. Sophia Nakamura had requested a transfer to another department, unable to face the daily reminder of how she'd failed her Hippocratic oath. Her medical competence had never been questioned, but her willingness to delegate patient assessment based on another's obvious bias had shattered her confidence. The transfer had been approved, though her personnel file would forever contain documentation of the incident. Dr. Theodore Langley opened his laptop and reviewed the systematic changes he'd implemented since taking office. The patient advocacy program now required every patient complaint to be reviewed by 2 independent staff members within 4 hours. No single nurse or administrator could dismiss a patient's concerns without documented medical justification. The program had already prevented 3 similar incidents in the past 2 weeks. The mandatory anti-discrimination training had been expanded from a single online module to a comprehensive 40-hour program. Every staff member, from janitors to department heads, would complete intensive workshops on implicit bias, cultural competency, and patient rights. Failure to complete the training within 60 days resulted in immediate termination. The hospital board had initially balked at the expense, but board chairman Margaret Sullivan had made it clear that lawsuits would cost far more than education. Nurse Amanda Reyes appeared at his office door, wearing standard blue scrubs and carrying a clipboard. Her hesitation during the original incident had saved her job, but barely. She'd completed extra training and had become one of the most vocal advocates for patient rights in the emergency department. Dr. Langley, the new patient intake protocols are showing remarkable results, she reported, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty it had held 3 weeks ago. Patient satisfaction scores have increased by 30%, and complaint resolution time has been cut in half. The new protocols required every patient to receive a welcome packet explaining their rights, including the direct phone number to his office for any concerns about discrimination or inadequate care. The complaints that had resulted were eye-opening, revealing patterns of subtle bias that had existed for years throughout the hospital system. Dr. Theodore Langley nodded, reviewing the statistics on his screen. What about staff compliance with the new documentation requirements? Universal compliance so far, Nurse Amanda Reyes replied. Every patient interaction must be documented within 2 hours, and supervisors review random samples daily. The staff knows that patient care isn't negotiable anymore. The documentation requirements had been perhaps his most effective reform. Every decision to defer treatment, every assessment of patient credibility, every interaction with security had to be justified in writing with medical evidence. The paper trail made discrimination nearly impossible to hide and provided clear accountability for patient care decisions. After Nurse Amanda Reyes left, Dr. Theodore Langley walked through the hospital corridors, observing the changes that had transformed the institution. In the emergency department, new signs in multiple languages explained patient rights and complaint procedures. The triage process now required 2 independent assessments for any patient whose treatment was delayed or denied. The waiting area buzzed with activity, but the hostile atmosphere he'd experienced was completely gone. Dr. Catherine Brennan approached him near the cardiac unit, wearing her white coat over a red blouse. She'd been promoted to emergency department supervisor after demonstrating the integrity to question Nurse Rosalind Pearce's initial assessment. Her willingness to challenge discrimination, despite potential professional consequences, had marked her as leadership material. The Medical Ethics Review Committee wants to present your case at the national conference next month, she informed him. They believe it could become a foundational case study for addressing systemic discrimination in healthcare. The request didn't surprise him. The incident had already been documented in medical journals and nursing education programs. The clear example of how discrimination could literally endanger lives had resonated throughout the healthcare community. Medical schools were using the case to teach students about the intersection of bias and patient care, while nursing programs emphasized the professional obligation to advocate for all patients, regardless of personal assumptions. Dr. Theodore Langley paused at the window overlooking the emergency department entrance. The same automatic doors through which he'd walked in pain and desperation now welcomed patients to a fundamentally different institution. The changes weren't just policy adjustments, but cultural transformation that reached every corner of the hospital. The financial impact had been significant but worthwhile. Patient lawsuits had dropped to 0, while positive reviews and community trust had increased referrals by 20%. The initial investment in training and system overhaul was already paying dividends in improved reputation and reduced legal liability. The hospital board had gone from skeptical to enthusiastic as the positive results became undeniable. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Jonathan Ellis, his former colleague, who had confirmed his identity during the crisis. The message read, "Saw the article about St. Mary's reforms in the medical journal. Proud of how you turned a nightmare into positive change. The whole medical community is watching." The attention was both gratifying and sobering. Dr. Theodore Langley understood that his experience had been documented not just as a cautionary tale, but as a blueprint for institutional change. Hospitals across the country were requesting consultation on implementing similar reforms, recognizing that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, but operationally devastating. The systematic nature of the changes had been crucial. Individual punishments might satisfy the desire for justice, but only comprehensive reform could prevent future incidents. The Patient Bill of Rights, now posted in every room, wasn't just decoration, but enforceable policy backed by real consequences. The anonymous reporting system had uncovered dozens of smaller incidents that might have escalated without intervention. As evening approached, Dr. Theodore Langley returned to his office for a final review of the day's reports. The transformation of St. Mary's General Hospital from a place where discrimination nearly cost him his life to an institution leading national healthcare reform felt surreal. The trauma of gasping for breath while being dismissed as a drug seeker had been converted into systematic protection for countless future patients. The irony of Nurse Rosalind Pearce's downfall remained striking. Her assumption that a black man in the emergency department must be seeking drugs had blinded her to every piece of evidence contradicting her bias. The insurance card, medical terminology, professional demeanor, and clear symptoms had all been dismissed in favor of racist assumptions. Her prejudice had been so complete that she'd sabotaged her own career while attempting to humiliate someone she'd considered beneath her. The latest report from Human Resources showed that staff diversity had increased significantly since the incident. The hospital's reputation for addressing discrimination had attracted talented healthcare professionals from underrepresented communities who had previously avoided the institution. The improvement in patient care had been measurable, with cultural competency enhancing treatment outcomes across all departments. Dr. Theodore Langley closed his laptop and prepared to leave the office that had become the headquarters for institutional transformation. The chest pain that had brought him to the emergency department had been real and dangerous, but the discrimination he'd faced had revealed an even more serious condition, affecting the entire hospital system. The treatment had been comprehensive, addressing not just individual symptoms, but the underlying disease of systemic bias. The reforms would outlast his tenure as chief of staff, embedded in policy and culture throughout the institution. Future patients would never know how close St. Mary's General Hospital had come to being a place where discrimination could prove fatal. The changes ensured that every person walking through those emergency department doors would receive care based on medical need rather than racial assumptions. As he walked toward the parking garage, Dr. Theodore Langley reflected on the complete transformation of his relationship with this building. The place where he'd been denied basic human dignity had become the platform for creating lasting change in healthcare delivery. The pain and humiliation had been converted into protection for countless others who would never experience what he'd endured. The story of that terrible day would be told in medical schools and ethics committees for years to come. But the real victory was in the patients who would receive compassionate care because systematic reform had replaced individual bias with institutional accountability. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.